tend to try and not make this a political speech because we don't chase the elephant and we don't chase the donkey. And as a pastor I heard once said, we chase the lamb. And so if we had a Democratic president or a Republican president doing what I saw is being reported right now in the last 48 hours, I'd be reporting it to you. The executive branch of government, without using this document or this power source, it is reported, has looked at Christian organizations that have ministries, 501c organizations, that are doing things like adopting and providing homes to children that don't have homes, and said, you know what, we're going to add a new condition for you to have your 501c3 status and be able to, for you to be able to receive money from the federal government. And that is that you cannot follow your religious beliefs with regard to sexual orientation and hiring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's reported that's a trial balloon, so that, hey, if we can get away with that, then maybe we go after your ministry next month. Or where's Ken? We go after your ministry next month. The question that I teach my students in common law class is whenever you see the president acting or a Republican member of Congress acting or a Democrat member of Congress acting and you see them exercising power, the question you need to ask, where did you get the authority to exercise that power? And are you exercising power within the scope of that constitutional power source? And if it's not there, then it's improper. So why do these things continue to happen? Well, if the American people do not speak, people that exercise power are going to continue to exercise power. That's the first step in the process. Not only do folks that work in this building and work in this building have to have a proper power source, they have to exercise within the scope of that proper power source, but then they also must, let's assume that they're doing that, they also must make sure that they don't violate some other part of the Constitution. All right. Does everybody understand the first part first? It's pretty self-explanatory. Let me give you one quick explanation. I'll give you an example that everybody's aware. Everybody's aware of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. When Congress passed Obamacare, what did they have to do? They had to go to the Constitution. Now, when it was being done, everybody out there that liked it on the side that they wanted affordable health care and Obamacare, they said, oh, well, Congress has the power to do that. It's commerce. It's commerce. Congress can regulate commerce among the states. Well, I don't know if you read about this, but when that question actually went to the Supreme Court, and the president sent his lawyer over to the Supreme Court to argue the case, he said, well, it's really a tax. And Congress has the power to tax. That's why it's constitutional. And so Congress said, you're right. It would be unconstitutional if they tried to use the commerce power, because this isn't commerce among the states. Since it is a tax, though, and so Congress does have the power to tax, and that's why Obamacare is considered a constitutional law. That's only part of the process, though. When Congress or the president act, not only must they act within the scope of a constitutional power source, they must also make sure that they don't violate one of your fundamental, unalienable liberties. The Bill of Rights, your right to free speech. They cannot interfere with your right to the free exercise of religious conscience. And for many years, using the worldview lens that I told you about, on issues of marriage, the right of a man and a woman to marry and procreate and control the upbringing of the child that they procreated, for throughout the entire history of the United States, any time that government tried to use its power to interfere with any of one of those things, the law was struck down and found unconstitutional if government tried to interfere with the right of a man and a woman to marry, to procreate, or control the upbringing of their child. And so, in the early cases questioning marriage, the court recognized that marriage was an institution that was one of the most important, institution in the American Republic, and we needed to preserve that as a very, very high liberty, because when a man and a woman marry, they procreate, and they ensure the survival of the nation. And that was the rationale and the basis for protecting the right of a man, the right of marriage, which is a right of a man and a woman to marry and control, direct the upbringing of a child that they procreate. Well, if liberty is a limitation on the exercise of government power, and if liberty, especially fundamental liberty, can stop a government action, the light doesn't go on because the liberty is being interfered with, how does that work? Well, let me show you very quickly. What the Supreme Court does is they've got a special microscope they keep in the Supreme Court closet, and any time that government uses its power in a way that interferes with a citizen's liberty, their fundamental liberty, they bring out that microscope and they put that law underneath the microscope. And they look at it very, very closely, and they say, do you have a compelling government? Do you have the most compelling interest in the world for invading on and interfering with that fundamental liberty interest? For example, the free exercise of religious conscience, or the right of a man and a woman to marry, or the right of a man and a woman who are married to raise their child without government interference. You don't have a compelling interest, government? Well, guess what? Your law is unconstitutional. And even if the government has a compelling government interest, they got to then show that they have been using the least restrictive means possible to carry out whatever that compelling government interest is. How many laws that interfere with your fundamental liberty do you think survive that kind of scrutiny? Not very many. Not very many at all. If liberty is a limitation on the exercise of government power, then guess what you want to do if you're engaging in some very bad conduct and you don't want the government to interfere with you anymore? You want to recharacterize that conduct that you're engaging in as liberty. Because guess what? Government can always regulate bad conduct, can't they? They can even regulate sexual conduct, can't they? It's against the law to rape. It's against the law to have sex with a child. It's against the law to murder and to engage in all sorts of bad conduct, isn't it? Government can regulate conduct, even sexual conduct. And if you're engaging in sexual conduct that's unhealthy, immoral, or dangerous, and you want to be able to engage in that conduct without the government interfering with you anymore, what's your strategy? Well, how about getting somebody in the Supreme Court put on a different worldview lens, and let's not worry about what real truth is anymore. Let's take conduct that the government can prohibit and recharacterize it, and let's call it liberty. And so, what happened a number of years back is that people that wanted to engage in the killing of unborn children, something that was against the law in virtually every state because the government can regulate conduct that is unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral. What they did is they went to the Supreme Court and they said, you know what, you need to have a new approach to interpreting the Constitution. This is conduct. It's not really conduct. Abortion is not conduct. Partial birth abortion is not conduct. It's liberty. It's a woman's liberty. It's called liberty. It's called privacy, to have my own personal autonomy to do whatever I want to do. And so a majority of the court said, you know what? We are going to recharacterize that conduct. We're going to call it fundamental liberty. And from this day forward, there is a fundamental right to personal privacy, personal autonomy. Now, they did that in a very incremental way, but they got the idea, and I got to watch the time here. If someone can give me like a 30-minute and then a 15-minute left type thing. They did it in a very incremental way, but a very strategic way, and they learned it from Darwin's Origin of the Species, actually. There was a Harvard professor who had read Darwin's Origin of the Species and said, you know what, hey, I like the way that we've changed and got rid of the Christian influence and impact on science. I'm going to take that idea that was in Darwin's Origin of Species, and I'm going to hire a law school dean, and I'm going to say, let's do that living constitution idea, or that evolving living thing, and let's put it into constitutional law. And they did. And they developed a theory of law that says whoever gets to sit in this building, whoever holds power, doesn't have to look at truth anymore. They can make it up for themselves. And they can evolve that truth. And so, even though everybody in this room knows that in the beginning, God created us, and that he saw that what he created was good, and he said that he created us in his image, and because he created us in his image, you know, our life has value. I think one of the speakers talked about, you know, the passages that show that God knows us even before we're born, that you know, he knew us when we were knit in our mother's womb. That's a self-evident truth, and that's why humans have dignity, because we are created in God's image, and that's why God said, don't murder what I've said has immense value. I've created your life, and I've created you in my image. But under this new living constitution, this evolving Darwinistic role, we get rid of that truthful worldview, and we say, no, it's all about me. It's all about personal autonomy. And so in the area of abortion, they started out with contraception, and then they evolved it to abortion, and then they tried to evolve it to partial birth abortion. And then guess what they did? This idea of personal autonomy, it's all about me. That's the fundamental liberty. If you're interfering with that fundamental liberty of personal autonomy, we're going to stop you. They said, okay, let's go after... Well, we'll try to get assisted suicide and euthanasia in there eventually, but let's go after marriage next. And so, to get there, then there was a case, well, let me put on the correct worldview lens first. There was a case in the Supreme Court that was looking at a law that prohibited deviant sexual conduct between people of the same sex. Again, it's a law that was there in the interest of the government. When they used that power to make that law, they were regulating against what? Unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. And the court said, because this is unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct, the government is okay in using its power to regulate it and say it's wrong. Not many years later, though, after the abortion cases and the partial birth abortion cases, the court puts on its secular, humanistic worldview lens and says, we don't have to look at truth. And they had another case in front of them that said, we're going to regulate unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct between the sexes. And this time the court struck down the law. How did they do it? They went to the partial birth abortion cases and the abortion cases, and they literally cut and pasted the law right out of it. Cut and pasted it. It's the exact same wording. Cut and pasted it and put it in here and says, this is really about personal liberty. This is really about personal autonomy. This isn't unhealthy, dangerous conduct. This is about personal autonomy. So now it's no longer dangerous conduct the government can regulate. Now it's liberty that if government tries to regulate it, we're going to strike it down. But we would never advance this idea and regulate marriage that way. Yeah, right. How long do you think it took the lawyers who wear this kind of worldview lens to take those cases and say, okay, now we're going after marriage? And that's exactly what they did. And the question before the court right now is, should we now prohibit the government from defining marriage truthfully? Or can we as a court, do we have the power to undo and redefine that truthful definition of marriage? That's what's before the court right now. A couple of things can happen. The court can say, you know what, this is an issue that the courts really ought not to get involved with. And so we're going to let each state decide whether or not they're going to have a truthful definition of marriage. For us, that's going to be a victory, because then we're going to be allowed to go into each state and try and argue for the truth. What the court is more likely to do is to say, you know what, the people of Michigan, for example, because that's one of the cases that's in the court, and we represented 25,000 African-American churches and pastors to try and explain the difference of why this is not a civil right, the difference between conduct and real equal protection. The court could say this is a matter of equal protection. Or this is a matter, this is just like all these other cases. This is a fundamental liberty, and if the government tries to define marriage any other way, what's that? 30 seconds? 30 minutes. Thank you. If the government tries to define marriage in any other way, then we're going to strike that government action down. Now this is, and we've got some articles that we've written on this in addition to the brief, and if you go to American Thinker, they published one yesterday as well, and I think we've got some copies of one that Renew America or somebody published. You should take some time and read those, because it provides the arguments, and I don't know if you've noticed, but only one side of the argument's in the press. You know, there's an appearance that there's only one side to this thing, and you're just a Neanderthal idiot if you have a different argument. Well, the reason that I think the press and the left is taking that approach is because they know they cannot win an argument with equal advocates standing in the same room and discussing it. It takes about 5 or 6 questions in a debate, and they're done. They cannot support this position. Because if it really is not about truth, the marriage between a man and a woman to procreate and control and direct the upbringing of the child, and it's really about liberty, it's all about my own personal autonomy and anything I want to do goes, then they cannot defend that position, because today they're asking for 2 women or 2 men to get married, and it won't even be tomorrow. It's already happening, because the people that aren't getting enough press right now, though, I love it when the left starts to fight with themselves. But, well, what about, the right of a man to marry a child? The child exploitation laws are at great risk after this case comes down within a number of years. Before that happens, the evolution, though, will be very slow. Before that happens, it'll be we get to marry more than one person. Or in a more enlightened society, I suppose I love my pet so much, so if it's all about intimacy and it's no longer about the larger needs of the nation and the larger needs of others, if it's just about intimacy and personal autonomy, I guess a larger enlightened nation, I ought to be able to marry my dog too. But that's my point, is the argument is flawed. Their argument is flawed from the very beginning. It does not have... If you take it to its logical conclusion, it takes you to a very, very dark place. It takes you to a very, very dark place. Raising children. Well, before we get there, how about procreating children? just so you know, this battle has been going on throughout our whole nation. I told you about that Harvard Law president who hired a law dean who said, change the way we look at the law. The first justice on the Supreme Court that came through that system decided a case called Buck v. Bell, in which a young woman was deemed by some local government official who had his power, and so he wanted to exercise power, and said, you know what, I don't think you should be somebody that should have children. You know, in my view, you're not the right kind of person to have a child, and so I order your sterilization. And the social worker ordered the sterilization. And the Supreme Court justice that was the first one out of this new worldview said, that exercise of power is absolutely proper. He said, in his opinion, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So government, go ahead. You decide whose life has value, whose life has not, whose lives are worth procreating, and who's not worthy of procreating. I'm not making this stuff up. This is all in our history. Supreme Court later, in a very similar case, involving the government trying to sterilize somebody, struck the government action down. Now, it wasn't a theocracy, didn't have to cite the Holy Bible, but that second decision is what? It's informed by a worldview that says all life has value. And we in this room know that all life has value because God created it, and He created it in His image. This battle has been going on for a very, very long time. Is it about the other? Is it about God? Is it about right and wrong? Is it about truth? Or is it all about me? Is it all about my personal autonomy, my personal pleasure, and whatever I want, and government, don't you even think about interfering? Which worldview is going to ensure that this democratic republic is going to be around for another 100 years? This case is probably the most important case that I've seen come through the court in my lifetime. Because if the court rules in favor of it's all about me and my personal sexual pleasure and personal autonomy, then how long do you think it's going to take the lawyers on the other side to start using the power of government to say, oh, Christian school, Christian college, your students apply for federal student loans? Guess what? Your university has a faith statement. It interferes with the fundamental right of people to have personal sexual pleasure because you're saying that you need to apply to God's standards in your faith statement. Guess what? None of your students any longer get federal loans. And if you think I'm making this up, you go right now, presidents of Christian universities all throughout the country are discussing this in intense terms because they know this is coming if the court goes the way it goes. Back to the ministries that we are talking about. How long do you think it's going to take the government using its power to say, well, the court has recognized this as a fundamental liberty. We are now going to apply it to all areas. Pastor, you want to marry somebody? Better be anybody. Right now, pastor, based on their sincerely held religious beliefs, if somebody came in and said, you know, and people are doing this just to test the waters. I want to marry my boyfriend here. And they come in, and the pastor says, no. There's going to be a statute out there. In fact, it's already written in many states and in many counties and many local townships. There's going to be a statute in there that says, no, now you can be sued because this church is providing a service. The service is marriage. And it's considered a public accommodation because you're providing it, and therefore you cannot discriminate on the basis of someone's sexual preferences. And you just did that, therefore you are subject to a lawsuit. You're going to get to hear a little bit from my colleague, Dave Coleman, one of the founders of the Great Lakes Justice. Case after case after case after case after case like this is already happening. And one of the cases, and I'm going to save the case that he's going to talk about for him, but one of the cases that we had come across our desk is somebody, you heard about the cake case, right? Where the Christian was taken to the administrative tribunal, and it's caught, they're losing their life savings, they're losing their fortunes, they're being challenged by the government. The government's using its power because somebody exercised their religious conscience. Now, were they discriminated based on sexual orientation? Absolutely not. They'd made hundreds of cakes before, as far as I understand. They had made a lot of cakes before for people with sexual preferences, but this cake they were being asked to participate in a marriage, which is something that was sacred to them, and it was against their religious conscience. Christian lawyers all the time take all kinds of cases. They don't ask what somebody's sexual preference is when they come in the door. If they're a victim of a car accident or something, Christian lawyers would represent these guys. They're not going to not represent them. They're not going to ask what their sexual preference is. Somebody came in, though, and asked a Christian lawyer, I think we need to sue this church because it won't marry two men. Well, now we got a different story, don't we? We've got religious conscience involved. And what do we know about liberty again? The exercise of government power. You've got a statute. The exercise of government power, you've got a statute that says you cannot no longer discriminate that way. Well, what I would do if I was a Christian lawyer, if I was a Christian baker, I would then say, what? You're interfering with my First Amendment right of free exercise of religious conscience. Bring out the microscope and strike that government action down. Well, guess what? Now we got a problem. Because now we've got a court after the marriage case. The court's going to say, well, now we got two fundamental rights that are colliding with each other. So which one should have precedence? All around the world, in Canada, Australia, and Europe, and the European Union, and country after country in Europe, when those two things did collide, the free exercise of religious conscience and the right of sexual preference and orientation, which one do you think every court every time says must give way? Your right of religious conscience. We need to prepare. We need to prepare because this is going to come, and it's going to come very fast. And I was telling you about the cake maker. A Christian, in response to that, probably with a little civil disobedience in mind behind it, or at least a little agitation in mind behind it, then said, well, you know what? I wonder if an LGBT cake owner would make a Bible cake for me. And so he went to 9 of these LGBT cake makers, and everyone said, I won't make that, that offends me. Except for one who was willing to charge him like $1 gazillion to make it. And so just to make a point, he then went to that same tribunal that had persecuted that Christian just months earlier, and guess what that tribunal immediately said? You don't have a case. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. We're helping with that case. That case is on appeal. Jesus says, I am the truth and I am the way. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. he also says, woe to you lawyers. Why did he say, woe to you lawyers? Because we hold this key of knowledge, and what do? We've just said, truth doesn't matter anymore. Truth doesn't matter anymore. So yes, woe to us lawyers. How we respond matters. That's why I want to give you that book. If you cannot afford that book, I want you to take that book anyways, and I want you to read it. Somebody else, if the Lord's blessed you with prosperity in some way, throw a couple extra dollars so the next person gets printed as well. Understand the shift in worldview that has happened. And understand how we, what's that? Understand how we respond matters. We cannot play the same game that the other side does. We have to respond in a way that they see Jesus in our hearts. We have to, what does the Bible say that we're supposed to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have? We can't just say, well, it's in the Bible, so you're wrong. Well, that may work in the pew with the guy next to us who's a believer, but we need to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have. And we need to do it with a loving heart so they see the heart of Jesus in our hearts. And we need to be ready to prepare for the persecution that is likely to come. And I am not going to give a talk about civil disobedience yet. I'm holding that talk off. I've had this in my pocket for 3 years. And I pray that the court will come down with a different decision. But I can tell you right now, if my government that I love, my country that I love, commands me to do something that my God tells me I shall not do, then you could take me away and you can take my prosperity. But here I stand. I pray that we are ready. I pray that we can be a force for cultural change and to retake some of this ground that the other side has improperly taken away. But I also know that if we lose, and that if this nation becomes a very dark place to live in, I know that each one of us are points of light. And I know that my God has always left a remnant. He has always left a remnant. And so we will either be a forceful cultural change and betterment in this culture, or we will be a remnant that we will, until the time that the time is over. And we never know when that will be. But we will be a remnant, and so maybe it's your child or your grandchild that will bring back truth to the culture. But to be a remnant, we have to be equipped. We have to study. We have to know the truth. We have to know right and wrong. That's why I love these godly pastors who are in the Word every day and that are saying, get your family in the Word every day. I'm going to recommit to do that. When I worked in all 3 of the branches that you see up there. Before I was allowed to exercise any power at all, before I was given the privilege of power, I had to put my left hand on the Bible closest to my heart and raise my right hand toward heaven. And I had to promise to uphold that Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God. Before I could do a single thing as a federal judge, before I could do anything in my other capacities in those other branches of government, I had to first stop every time and ask, is it right or is it wrong? Is it true? Is it untrue? Is it just or is it unjust? Why? Because I don't care if you're the President of the United States or if you're a federal judge, you are under God. And again, we're not talking about a theocracy, but we are talking about a nation that is trying to exclude you from the political process. If you don't speak, they'll be successful. Because if the nation's government can be informed by secular viewpoints, it most certainly ought to be informed by sacred viewpoints, especially when the sacred viewpoints are true. So I challenge you, and you've heard the story from a pastor before, maybe somewhere, picture the room all dark black. Close all the blinds, and you make it as dark as you want in here. If I light a match, and I light a lighter, I don't care how dark you try to make it, you cannot extinguish that light. Because it's the light that pierces the darkness. The darkness can never overcome the light, and we know that because our Lord tells us that. And that's my challenge to you. In the face of the darkness that will surely come, speak truth, speak it in love, equip yourself, be ready to speak truth so that you can give a reason for the hope that you have. And then know that not a sparrow falls to the ground. The Lord will protect you. The Lord will protect you.